everybody. I want to welcome you again today. And we're talking to Elisa, and she is a reproductive counselor with Twig Fertility in Toronto. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what that is in her role, as well as all of the things that she does for the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. So Elisa, welcome. What is your professional role? How do you describe a reproductive counselor?
Yeah, so at Twig, my role is to do a couple of things. Not a lot of fertility clinics out there have an in-house counselor, so we're sort of playing a little bit about what this should look like. But I guess what I do, I offer general counseling. Obviously, there's a lot of ups and downs that come with this process. I offer specific check-ins before people undergo an IVF cycle, because obviously there's a lot that can be sort of emotionally and physically challenging about that. And another big part of my role is offering third-party counseling sessions, which is required of anybody who is using a donor gamete, so donor eggs or donor sperm, or anyone who is using a surrogate.
Okay.
So that is generally what my job looks like. And I also offer webinars about emotional health during your fertility journey. We're hoping to open some groups in the fall, some support groups. So that's what I do here.
Excellent.
Okay.
Now, how does the work that you do specifically help the 2S LGBTQIA plus community as they're growing or thinking about growing or starting their respective families?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is, like I just said, the third-party reproductive counseling sessions. They're required by Health Canada for anybody, like I said, who's using a donor or a surrogate, which inevitably means almost all queer families are required to meet with me, which on the one hand, I understand why that could be frustrating for people to have to go to counseling. Like if you're queer, obviously that is not why, but that is sort of what ends up happening. Sure. I also, on the other hand, hope they're a nice moment to sort of check in. There's a lot that goes into making decisions around using donors. There's a lot of emotional stuff that can and often does come up. So I hope they're helpful times for people to just sort of take a minute to breathe and talk through some decision making about anything that's coming up. So that's a big part of that's a big touch point for a lot of queer families who are going through fertility. Like everyone's gonna have to do it no matter what clinic they're working with. And then just more generally, this is a difficult process for anybody, right? Whether you're, no matter what your family looks like. And I hope to be here to support people in any way that they need. And I think in some ways, this process can look a little bit different for queer families. Like you're not necessarily coming in because you've been trying to have a baby for 5 years and you're coming in with all this sort of grief and emotional kind of turmoil. Like a lot of people are starting out and there's a lot of joy and excitement, and that's awesome. That doesn't mean also that some queer people don't experience fertility issues, right? And that's sort of its own kind of niche, because often you don't know, right, until you've started, and that can be really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about it being sort of what has to happen if you're going through reproductive assistance to have and start a family, and you're using a donor egg or surrogate or sperm, that you have to speak with a reproductive counselor. Yes. Do you hear a lot of people offering really strong feelings one way or the other about their donor? Do you have opinions, or do you, I shouldn't ask if you have opinions, because as a counselor you're probably supposed to stay fairly neutral, but how do you navigate that the known donor versus unknown donor kind of avenue?
Yeah, absolutely. And some people come in with very strong desires or preferences, and some people are kind of open and they're trying to figure it out. And I think there's a lot that goes into making a decision either way. I think there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages maybe to either having an unknown donor versus someone that you know. And there's different kinds of decision making that goes into that. Like in some ways, just logistically, it can be easier to go with a donor from a sperm or an egg bank. And I only say that because the bank has done a lot of the work already, right? Like they've already had, like the donors already have their kind of their counseling consult, they've already gone through genetic testing, they're already vetted in a lot of ways. And you just go online and you order it and it is delivered to your fertility clinic, right? Like there's a lot that's just sort of easy about that.
Right.
If you want to go with a known donor, that's somebody that you know or is in your social circle or in your community, like you have to do a lot of that work yourself, right? So that means you have to make sure that everybody has had their counseling consult. You have to make sure that everybody has undergone genetic testing if that's something you're interested in. You're in charge of doing the legal documentation. So there is a lot more kind of logistical work there. When you're thinking about an anonymous donor, I think in this day and age, there's not really any anonymity anymore, right? Like you won't know who your donor is potentially, like as you're ordering, but with the kind of prevalence of at-home genetic testing, like anybody can find anybody now. And so there is that to think about, like it might be that you or your kids or whatever might find like they have an aunt on ancestry.com or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
so there is that to think about as well, for better or for worse, right? And some people go through a sperm donor with an open ID and they can, your children can find them later and have a nice relationship. Like obviously those are possible. And there's also avenues through which to meet other children who are, have the same donor as you. And some people really like that and have nice little kind of donor families.
Yeah.
Which can be lovely. But of course, there is like a distance kind of inherently built into that. If you're going with a known donor, I think for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to have an extended family, which some people really like. And I think for people, we're used to that. We're used to chosen family. We're used to extended families. And I think for some people that feels really comfortable. But on the other hand, there's also just a lot to think about in terms of family dynamics, boundaries, decision-making, how involved do you want someone to be in your kid's life, in your family's life? What are those roles going to be? And it takes a lot of initial conversation and a lot of ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. And it's something that we kind of think about peripherally, I think, when we're thinking, okay, so, in my case, perhaps we're a lesbian couple, we are going to need sperm. So where do we get that sperm from? Should we use somebody we know? Should we use somebody we don't know?
Yes.
And you have this sort of peripheral idea, and then you get into parenting, you realize how involved it can be. And so speaking with someone like you gives them the opportunity to be reminded, these are things you may want to think about now, because they may present 10, 15 years down the road. So it's excellent. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's excellent that they need to do that, even if they don't realize in advance how important it is to do that, if that makes sense. Because we've all heard of people say, you have to go for counseling, and we think of it as being such a negative, but 9 times out of 10, people have been through counseling and look back on it and think that was the best decision I ever made, right?
I mean, I certainly hope so. And I really hope, at least here, to provide just a space to talk instead of saying like, okay, we got to talk about X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to check them off. Right. And there's some element of that is true. But I also hope that it's exactly like you said, a chance to really think about things that, there's so much else going on. Right?
Sure.
Like there's like appointments, and there's finances, and there's a physical toll on your body. And it can be hard to take that time to be like, okay, look, I really have to think about some of these conversations that I need to have.
Yeah, no, it's very, very true. Are there things that you might look for working in the capacity that you do that your clients would argue makes you better suited to work with the 2S LGBTQIA plus community than perhaps heterosexual professionals who work in a similar capacity?
Yes. Sure. Research has shown that the most important thing about counseling, this is true in my role, but also just in therapy in general, right? Like the most important indicator of success, whatever that might mean, is that you feel connected to and comfortable with your provider, right? Like that matters way more than anyone's training or modality or approach or whatever. And so I think for a lot of people, there is a little more comfort with having another queer provider. That's not always true, obviously, and there's a lot of personality that goes into that too, and it might be that you just jive with a different provider, and that's great. But But I do think there are some things to be said about feeling like somebody understands your life, right? And your life history and your community
Yeah.
and your sort of culture and the history and all of that. And, that you feel like someone might have connections to other providers, other resources, like having someone within that community. Yeah, just a shared understanding, a shared vocabulary. You don't need to explain yourself. I mean, I think we've all been in a healthcare situation where you feel like you have to explain yourself, right? And that sucks.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
For sure.
yeah, and just in my role, more specifically, like these are things I think about. These are things that my friends are thinking about. These are things that are happening in my community. Like I sort of all my queer friends, right? Like we all have to do this in some capacity if we want to have a family, right? So
Right.
it's normal. It feels normal to me.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, and I think this is true for any service provider. I think there's just a little bit of relief at not having to explain your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I fully agree with you. Are there pearls of wisdom that you've learned over the years that your clients are especially lucky to learn from you that they may not learn from anyone else?
Yeah. I don't know if this is something that they wouldn't learn from somebody else, but one thing that and this really harkens back to our conversation a minute ago, but I think one thing that's really important when you're thinking about starting your sort of family building or your fertility journey, and kind of like I said before, like there's so much to plan for it and think about, right? You're sort of preparing yourself physically, you're having conversations about finances, like you're having conversations about time and energy, in terms of like how many times you have to come to the clinic and how that interferes with work and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really important that people spend some time having conversations about kind of the emotional and relational aspects of this journey, right? So if you're kind of sitting out with your partner, if you have a partner, and having conversations like, how do I deal with stress? Like, how do I cope with disappointment? What are my coping skills when things are difficult? How do I feel when I get anxious? What do I need from you in those moments? Like, what are my boundaries in terms of what I'm willing to do with my body or with your body? Like, how many times am I willing to try X, Y, or Z procedure? Who are our support systems? How do we feel comfortable sharing information with the people in our lives, whether it's good news or bad news? Like having those conversations ahead of time. And then maybe you've had them before in different contexts, but knowing just what you and your partner need from each other, kind of going into this process ahead of time, can be really helpful. And obviously answers to those things change over time, but a lot of the difficulties I think couples have, or other family structures, but that relationships have in this process, is that people cope with stuff differently. People cope with grief differently. People cope with stress differently. People make decisions differently. And if you haven't really had an understanding conversation about like, this is what I need in those moments, that might not be what you need, like that can make a lot of these things easier.
Sure. 100%.
Yeah. And then I guess specifically of what I might offer as opposed to somebody else, and I think other providers have probably said the same thing, but I do also work in private practice doing relationship and sex therapy. So I do offer a little bit of a lens of a sort of healthy relationship and healthy sex lives. So.
Yeah. And that's important too. And that I think, I mean, and perhaps it's for anybody who's going through a fertility process. You don't want things to become simply mechanical. You want to be able to enjoy a healthy physical relationship as well as
Absolutely.
an emotionally intimate relationship.
Yeah. And knowing those things might change for a little while, right? It sometimes having to put, a medical framework on top of your intimate life, right, is not like a recipe for like a really sexy life. And that's okay. Like if your emotional relationship or your sexual relationship changes during this process, like that's okay. That's normal.
Yeah.
And being willing to sort of acknowledge that and sort of talk about those changes and how you'd like them to change after this is over. And then obviously there's a whole different conversation around that in parenthood, but
100%. But do you find sometimes that the people that you're meeting with at this point, with Twig Fertility, obviously you're meeting with them at the beginning or through their fertility process and journey. Do you find that many of your clients that you've met with pre-conception and pre-parenthood,
Yeah.
whether it's through surrogacy, egg donor or sperm donor, regardless of the family dynamic, reach out to you after they've become parents to revisit the value of needing to learn how to be a couple again in light of their new status
Yeah.
as parents too?
Yeah, that's a great question. Twig's only been open since January, so we don't have the luxury of having a lot of people we have people who have had successful pregnancies. We have not really had enough time for any, we haven't had our first Twig live baby yet. So, but that being said, in my private practice, I do see that a lot.
Yeah.
I do see a lot of couples who come to me, and queer couples and straight couples who, you know, they've had kids for maybe just a couple of years. Maybe went through a lot of fertility difficulties, or they've been parents for a long time, and they kind of look at each other like, I don't really feel like I know you anymore.
Right.
And that does happen. And I think
Mhm.
some portion of that is normal. But I also think that, there's definitely things that one can do to connect regardless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And revisiting our roles, right? Because
Yeah.
in a family dynamic, regardless of who the birthing parent is, who the non-birthing parent is, we take on different roles in any relationship, whether we have children or not. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
We take on different
Yeah.
roles
Yeah, of course.
in the relationship, and so after a period of time, sometimes we need to, I would think, revisit what those roles are and how we feel about the roles that we've been assigned or assigned to
Yeah.
ourselves, or
Yeah.
because that's how you get hard feelings, right?
Absolutely, right. And it can sometimes you just get into the swing of things and you don't really feel like you have the time or the space to have those conversations about roles, about whether you feel connected, about whether you feel like you're having your needs met.
Yeah.
And it's hard when you have small humans who have a lot of needs that need to be met. Right?
It's
And
true.
your needs aren't high up on the list anymore.
No, no.
Right.
Yeah. Is there anything we haven't covered yet that you feel is beneficial for our guests to learn about you?
That's a good question. I don't know if I know this is necessarily about me, but I do think I would like to add to sort of what I was saying before about the kind of conversations that people are having. And these are the conversations that I'm really having with queer couples and queer families when we have these counseling sessions. When you have two people who are socialized into having specific roles. So whether you're having maybe two people who think that they are fathers or feel like they are mothers, right? It can be really difficult when you're disconnecting some of those roles with the sort of biology of it, right? So you have two people and you're trying to decide like whose sperm are we using, right? Whose egg are we using? Whose body are we using to like carry pregnancy? For some people, like the answer to that feels easy, and that's awesome. And for some people, it's not easy, right? Like it's difficult to think about maybe having a child that's not genetically related to you, right? Because that's what we're taught parenthood looks like.
Yeah.
Right. And it can be difficult to think about like, oh, I'm not able to carry this child in the way that I want to, either because you don't have the right biology or because your body isn't sort of able to do that for whatever reason. And so having the ideas about disconnecting from what we think parenthood or motherhood or fatherhood looks like can be really hard, and there can be grief there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's totally makes sense. And right. So a lot of the conversations I'm having are like, wow, we're struggling with like whose sperm do we use? And that's totally makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That's hard. That's hard to have those conversations. And obviously you don't want to like hurt your partner, but your needs are valid. And so those are a lot of the things that like we work through, and hopefully people are working through as well on their own, but starting to really think about what parenthood looks like and means to you can be a helpful way to start with that.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was speaking to somebody recently, and they birthed the first child and their partner birthed their second child. And they really struggled with what their role was with the second child, because they had been the full-on hands-on birthing parent. They fed their baby from their body. Now their partner was the one who birthed the baby, feeding the baby from their body. And they felt like, what is my role now?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
last time my role was that, and this time it's this.
Yeah,
How do I reconcile that in my brain?
totally. Yeah, absolutely. Those are big things that people feel, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right. We're not grown up with stories about what non-biological parenthood looked like, really, in a
No,
way that feel really affirming.
no, no. No,
Yeah,
most of ours are stereotypes of,
yeah,
the non-birthing parent going to work and coming home and
yeah,
being there for a couple of hours or an hour before kids go to bed, and the
yeah,
role
exactly.
is, yeah, so it's not, you're right, it's not something that we've seen a lot of evidence of, so it's hard to navigate uncharted waters,
Yeah,
or at least
absolutely.
undocumented chartered waters.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as queer people, we have to do that kind of all the time.
Yeah,
And yet having to do it yet another time in a different way is really, it can be exhausting.
yeah.
But it can also be, I hope, very liberating too, right? Like you're able to create the roles in the family structure and the dynamic that you want. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I fully agree. I could sit and talk to you for hours, and I'm really enjoying this, but I promised I would let you get back on with your day. What is the best way for our viewers and potential clients to reach you so that they can set up some time to talk to you either in
Yeah.
person or virtually?
Yeah. And I'm offering both in person and virtual appointments, which I love being able to offer options.
Yeah.
If you are sort of going like starting your fertility journey up through like your first trimester, I'm available here at Twig. I am currently, as we're sort of moving towards a fuller capacity, I'm currently able to take on clients who are not Twig patients for either third-party reproductive counseling reports or general counseling. If you're sort of outside of that kind of starting your journey through the first trimester window, I am in private practice at East Toronto Therapy. So you can get in touch with me either here at Twig or I'm there. And I just wanted to say that, I've heard a lot of kind of horror stories about people in fertility clinics, and I recognize that people have a lot of negative experiences, either just kind of generally kind of feeling like they're in a factory setting or in more specific, like kind of queer, unaffirming ways. And I just wanted to say that at Twig, we're really, really trying to create a safe and affirming space for this community. I'm glad to sort of be here and be a part of this. We're trying to really work on our language, work on our forms, like on a really base way. Like I know for couples who get to a fertility clinic and they have, one of them is trying to like fill out paperwork about their sperm, right? Like, and they don't have sperm, like there's a lot of that kind of thing that happens. So we really are trying to create a safe and inclusive space for this community. So I'm really happy to be a part of that. And I hope that if some of you make your way our way, you find that to be true for you.
And I have to say, just in support of what you just mentioned, it is because of the work that Twig is wanting to do and has already started to do, and the mission and vision that they have, that Twig is the exclusive fertility clinic sponsor of this show, because they're the only ones that I know of that take our community under their wing and really want us to thrive, and they put their money where their mouths are in terms of that philosophy. So I mean, I'm grateful that I got to speak with you today, and for the work that you do, but also for the space that you work from, and it's all around a good thing.
We're always learning, but I think we're doing a pretty good job over here.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.